In today's episode, I want to talk about avoidance and limerence. I am fascinated with the concept of limerence, and of course I talk a lot about avoidance because I am an avoidant. I'm a fearful avoidant specifically, so that's the perspective I'm speaking from. And there's dismissive avoidance too, so that's like a different type of mentality in some cases. But one thing I really want to talk about when it comes to avoidant attachment or avoidance in your attachment, however it might manifest for you, and limerence is that the two seem to go hand in hand. Avoidants seem to be predisposed to preferring limerence in many cases. Now, of course, I'm not a therapist. I am not an attachment expert by any means. I'm just fascinated by these topics and I love learning about them, and I've learned a lot about them with regards to my own experience. But one thing I've noticed, and also talking to people, right? Because I host one-to-one calls and I speak to a lot of people who struggle with the same things that I struggle with. So we just get to chat about them and learn more about them together. Avoidants tend to prefer limerence because limerence allows you to exist in fantasy. And avoidants like fantasy in many cases because it allows you to not get too close to somebody. When the fantasy stops, right, when that bubble is burst and you see the reality of a person, you get close enough to them to see the vulnerability, the messiness, the ugliness of relationships sometimes, that stops being desirable. So it's easier and more comfortable, in some cases, not always, of course, there's nuance to this, but it's easier and more comfortable for an avoidant to instead lean towards limerence. And I think limerence, this experience of limerence, can apply to both the anxious attachment and the avoidant attachment. It can manifest differently for everyone. Again, I'm speaking from the fearful avoidant perspective, which has both anxiousness and avoidance. So I know how it manifests for my anxious side, and I know how it manifests for my avoidant side. The avoidance side, when it comes to limerence, wants to have this 1 foot in, 1 foot out experience, right? This ability to be in a relationship or be in some sort of relationship, to mimic it, because deep down they do desire connection and intimacy, but they fear it at the same time. They fear responsibility, they fear their own insecurities, they fear not being good enough, all these things. So while they want it, at the same time, they also feel like they have to hold themselves back. They have to put some sort of wall or block up. And one of those blocks, there are many that can occur for an avoidant, but one of them could be limerence. This idea of only allowing yourself to invest in a relationship when you know you can't have it, when you know that it is somehow star-crossed. There's no way to actually be in a relationship with this person. And in many cases, because that person that you're fantasizing over or in limerence over as the avoidant doesn't actually exist. Creating a fantasy of a person and living in that realm and wanting a connection with them is easier because they're not real. You're not really seeing that person. The avoidant isn't truly seeing them. They're seeing a fantasy that's easier to engage in some sort of romantic dynamic with, whether or not it's reciprocated. Oftentimes in limerence, it's not reciprocated. That's what makes that connection difficult. But it's easier to exist in that realm with a fantasy than it is with a real person, because if that person were to turn around and say, okay, yeah, let's be in a relationship. I'll let you see my vulnerabilities. I'll let you see my messiness and you show me yours. That's terrifying for an avoidant. They don't want that. It's really scary. Some are aware of this. Some are unconsciously experience this. So I'm here to say that everybody's different, right? So it's not going to apply 100% to everyone. This is just what I've learned from my own experience and the way I've seen it in myself and in other people in my life and what I've read about it. But if you are the avoidant and you notice yourself falling into this pattern, I think it's really important to recognize how engaging in limerence over and over again, or only allowing yourself to indulge in those feelings when in limerence, means you're holding yourself back from a true, deep, connected relationship with a person, which is what you ultimately want, but you fear it. And the thing that's holding you back, that's creating this block, is fear. But it's not necessarily good for you, right? It's not healthy for you, because what would be most desirable to you is that type of connection. But of course, that block is there, the fear is there, so it's holding you back from it. And so limerence seems like the safest option. So I'm not here to shame anybody who's experiencing this. I'm here to show you that it makes sense. It makes sense why you might be falling into limerence constantly and avoiding or resisting the people that, try to meet you halfway. But I don't think it's necessarily something that you should continue doing if you are aware of it. And I'm just trying to bring awareness to it if you haven't noticed it in yourself, if you are an avoidant who hasn't seen it yet. But also, if you have seen it, and you're still struggling with it, I want you to think about how it can in some way be an abandonment towards yourself to allow yourself to continue in limerence. Again, not to shame you by any means. It's just to shift your perspective on this and to recognize that while it might feel more satisfying in the short term to be in it because you get to feel these feelings and it creates, a bit of a distraction from your own life at times. It allows you to engage in something but not really be invested in it. So it kind of creates a bit of that excitement that you might want. It's a form of self-abandonment. You're abandoning your true needs and desires by doing that for short-term benefit, for short-term pleasure that isn't sustainable for you in the long run and is not truly good for you because it doesn't provide you the depth that you need as a human being in connections. And of course, everybody's different. What you need is going to be different than what I need or what anybody else needs. But I think if you understand what I'm talking about, you understand that there is something here that you are holding yourself back from experiencing. And limerence is the block there. It's the wall that you've created as the avoidant. There are many other walls that avoidance can create. Limerence is just one of them, and it can manifest differently for every avoidant, as I've said before. But to recognize that this is a way for you to betray yourself in a sense, which the more you do that, the more you abandon yourself, the more you betray yourself, the more you don't let yourself actually get into proper relationships because of this fear, the less you trust yourself. And the less you trust yourself, the less confident you feel in yourself, the more your insecurities breed. And the more insecure you feel, the less you're going to be willing to enter an actually authentic relationship because you don't want people to see those insecurities that you have, right? So it creates a cycle that it's really hard to break out of. But the more you allow it to happen, the more it creates the cycle. The deeper you fall into it, the more solidified it becomes for you. So it really is about stepping out of it. And I know that's easier said than done. It's really not easy. But I think the key for anybody who struggles with avoidance, as I've had to learn and go through myself, is vulnerability. I think the way to break out of limerence, like that limerent mindset, is to show up with your vulnerabilities and to let yourself see the other person's vulnerabilities, their fallacies, their failures, their flaws, whatever, and to show yours. Because obviously when you're in limerence, you're pedestalizing the other person. You're not truly seeing them. You're seeing this ideal version of them. You're not getting close enough to be able to see them, or they're not letting you get close enough because it's just not an aligned partnership, right? So it's whether it's from your own control or their control. And also what's happening, most likely, again, everybody's different, but most likely what's happening is you're also trying to put forward this best idealized version of yourself to be seen as amazing and to be chosen ultimately. But again, the irony is that if you were to be chosen, if that person were to turn around and be like, okay, let's get into this, let's do this, you'd probably run away because it's terrifying, right? So I think to realize that the way out of that, the way to work through that is to lean into vulnerability, to lean into being your messiest self and showing that to that person and letting them show you it too, to see how you feel about it and to face that fear a little bit, because that's what it is, right? The fear of being vulnerable, the fear of seeing yourself as imperfect, or to be faced with your own imperfections, because we're all imperfect. There is no such thing as perfection. But to be faced with that and to see theirs, to see it mirrored in them, right? See your own flaws mirrored in them, in your partner, because that is what happens. We're all mirrors of each other, right? That's also very terrifying. It's sometimes easier to be around people that you can idealize and use as a mirror in order to reflect your own idealized image to yourself, if that makes sense. It's easier sometimes to do that. It's safer, it's more comfortable, it feels a little bit better, but ultimately that's not truly authentic. It's not, it doesn't foster a deep connection with somebody, because the depths of connections require you to see all of it, to see the mess, to see the uncomfortable things, and to still choose to be there because you actually want to be there, not because you feel like you need to be there in order to satisfy something that you feel is maybe missing, like a void of some sort. And limerence helps to fill that void a little bit temporarily, but obviously that's not sustainable long term. You can't be in limerence for your whole life. I mean, you can be. I'm sure there's many people that do struggle with it for years. But what I mean is that's not going to feel good in the long run for you. It's not going to allow you to experience the kind of life you want to experience. It's going to be like a Band-Aid on a deep, deep wound. And I think ultimately, if you do truly want to get into a healthy, aligned, authentic relationship, if that's something that you really want, then it's important to work through limerence and face the fear of vulnerability and imperfection. And of course, you might not want to. You might want to stay in Limerence, and that's totally fine too. Like, I'm not here to tell anybody what to do, what not to do, what's right, what's wrong. It's your life. I'm just saying from my own experience as somebody who's gone through this and who also has had to work through my avoidance, who recognized it and had to work through it actively, because I had to tell myself, like, hey, leaning into avoidance is not going to give you what you want. It's not going to show you the results you want in your life. You're going to be holding yourself back from things that you deeply desire. You're going to be abandoning yourself. This is the way I've had to work through it. I've had to let myself step into vulnerability, which is terrifying. I am not saying this is easy by any means. I've talked about this so many times on my podcast. It is so much easier said than done. But taking one step towards it, just one small step into seeing somebody truly, recognizing a flaw in them, seeing a flaw in yourself, presenting a flaw of yourself to another person and seeing how they respond, seeing what happens, how things shift. Something even as small as that can really help you break out of this limerent trance, which that's what it feels like, right? It feels kind of like being in a trance, and it feels kind of like being manic sometimes, because it creates a fantasy world and you get to live in fantasy. And what's not fun about that for a bit? It's fun to live in that. But again, I am sure you also want to experience the breadth of life, the breadth of your emotional capacity. But that also means, one of those emotions is fear, right? You have to also lean into that. If you want the other emotions, you also have to lean in, or if you want all the good emotions, you also have to sometimes lean into the bad ones. They go hand in hand, right? You can't escape them. But it doesn't always have to be terrible. There's a lot we can learn about ourselves, even in the scary, uncomfortable emotions that we are resisting right now. So yeah, I hope this was helpful. I hope it gave you some insight. I hope it brought some awareness to you about your own experience with avoidance, with limerence, with fantasy, with holding yourself back, with self-abandonment, because that's a big component to this too. If you want to talk about this in more detail with me, feel free to book a one-to-one call. I also have a Substack where I write essays about this every week. I'm always writing on there. And also you can follow my social media accounts for all of my videos and other content. Other than that, thank you for listening, and I'll be back again soon with another episode.